Okay, it's time for a confession. My first real experience with 2D Metroid ever was Fusion. Sometime around 2002, a friend of mine sold me this Game Boy Advance, a little blue one. But being a broke college student, the only game I had for it for a long time was Super Mario Bros. 3. I went to visit my cousins for a week in Louisiana, who lived about 4 hours away, and there it was, sitting on a shelf in the living room. And I asked my cousin, could I play it while I was there? And he said I could keep it. So I slotted it into my crystal blue clear GBA, flipped the switch, and fell in love instantly with Metroidvanias. From the title screen, the presence of this game is brought into full focus. The opening music is terrifying, and as much as people complain about the quality of the GBA's sound chip, this game made full use of the available soundscape to be a genuinely scary experience. Okay, maybe scary or terrifying is inaccurate, but the tension at play is easily mistaken for terror, and Fusion genuinely thrives on the tension it creates. It maintains it throughout the experience over multiple playthroughs. Now, one of the principal complaints leveled against Metroid 4 is its linear nature. The player is not given a lot of freedom for sequence breaking like in Super Metroid, which is often considered a staple of the franchise. But this is limiting for the purpose of ramping up the tension. The narrative of the game limits the player by design. The obvious reason for this decision is to streamline the gameplay for a portable game system. Most people were not going to be able to beat this game in one sitting. The game needed to be designed to empower the player to pick it up and quickly be re-immersed back into the game. Objectives are laid out for you specifically for this reason. But underneath this philosophy of design, these decisions further serve the tension of the story. I said Zero Mission could be defined by the words adventure. And I would say Super Metroid's defining word would be intrigue, but Fusion's focus is this tension, which is why it succeeds at it so effectively. The linearity serves the focus, and to me, turns what others would call a weakness into a strength. The game is rich with detail. On my most recent playthrough, I noticed that every few missile shots Samus's arm cannon would smoke. I've played the game many times and never noticed it before. Nightmares swooping through the background, as many of you know in Sector 5, is a famous example. That's the stage for similar details present in Samus Returns and Metroid Dread. Samus's suit looks alive, which is especially impressive considering the size of her sprite on the tiny Game Boy Advance screen. The game is zoomed out more than Zero Mission would wind up being, and Samus's jump is sort of in between Zero Mission and Super Metroid's. It's faster than Super, but slower and more floaty than Zero Mission, and to me, it's just right. All the movement and control is streamlined. For example, rather than having Super and regular missiles be separate items, Fusion stacks their effect, allowing for an extra sense of progression, kind of like the arm cannon upgrades. The pacing in general is very well done, with a nice sense of development being integrated into the narrative. Indeed, this is probably the best implementation of Samus loses everything and gets it all back, trope that is bemoaned by some of the detractors of the series. It makes sense in the story, and you have an ever-present reminder of how much Samus has lost in the form of the SAX. Each encounter with the evil doppelganger is a nail-biting thrill, but progressively you become more and more capable of warding off its attacks until you are just barely on par with its abilities for the final showdown. The story in general is filled with some twists and turns, and while there's not anything groundbreaking going on here, there's still plenty of intrigue that once again serves the tension. The SAX in general is a more memorable antagonist than I would say even Dark Samus from the Prime series. And anytime you hear those heavy clunking footsteps nearby in the game, you pause and you take a deep breath. The The game has a sense of cinematography to it as well with the visuals. The close-up of the SAX in the opening comes to mind, but even in the gameplay there are little flourishes and touches that build up the experience. Sometimes the camera will not pan at the same speed as Samus's movement in certain rooms. It moves slowly, deliberately, to maximize the effect of what is revealed. Ridley in the freezer is a great example, but again the game pulls little tricks like this throughout, and it is very effective at building the mystery and intrigue in the player's mind. When the camera slows down, the player sits up for a little bit and pays close attention. For a 2D sprite game, this was another impressive achievement. The game is more difficult than most of the other titles in the series, but not frustratingly so. Bosses are very aggressive and they rush the player, sending out attacks over wide coverage. Or some of the bosses will have specific weak points that require the player to assess risk. Zazabi, the second boss, is an example. As it jumps around the room, it will randomly open its weak spot underneath and descend slowly. The player must run underneath the boss and fire missiles up, but if Zazabi lands on them, they take damage. Each time he loses a segment, he falls faster, and how many shots you can land before you take a hit shrinks. A lot of the bosses function in this fashion, though Zazabi is probably the simplest to identify. There is a risk versus reward dynamic made all the more prominent because of the damage the enemies can deal. Samus feels fragile in this game, and in my opinion that serves the narrative and theme yet again. I really like the backgrounds and the color palette of this game. I've noticed that it's not everyone's personal taste, but the brighter colors serve the tiny screen of the GBA well. It also makes sense from the narrative standpoint. The game feels very different from Super Metroid tonally, and a lot of this comes down to this decision to differentiate the colors. The environment feels more artificial, which is appropriate as the entire game takes place on a space station. The tiny details of the biomes recreated for the ship's research tell a story in their own way and drive home how dangerous the X-Parasites are. There is not a single environment they cannot invade, and by extension, thrive in. The only thing immune to them is Samus. Monsters like Ceres and the terrible Nightmare all were taken over by them. Even Ridley, who was already dead, is resurrected by them. And of course, the SAX itself shows that this time, Samus herself would also be completely helpless without the new Metroid DNA that she has. My favorite tune in the game is the one that plays anytime there's a mysterious element at play in the environment or story. It perfectly encapsulates the theme of the game while also displaying a curious intrigue. The soundscape in general really shines in spite of the hardware, and the music serves the story perfectly, telling the player how they should feel from moment to moment. My favorite sound effect is the chunky sound of super missiles when they hit things. It really sells how much stronger they are than the regular missiles. You're probably wondering if I have anything negative to say about this game, but honestly, I cannot think of anything. When taken into context of the hardware and even the franchise as a whole, the game feels like a perfect subversion of Super Metroid, and in my opinion, a more than worthy follow-up. The SAX has great presence, and the X-Parasites are a worthy success for the Metroids as the monster of the series. They call to mind the monster from The Thing, in the same way the Metroids called to mind the aliens from the original film that inspired them. The story is intriguing, and while many people bemoan how often gameplay is interrupted, these interruptions are short and help the player remember after long breaks in play where they were in the narrative and where they need to go. I've heard people say that this aspect affects their ability to replay the game, but of all the games in the franchise, this is the one I think I've replayed the most. That may be changing, honestly, because I've played Dread a whole lot since it came out, but I've been replaying all these games for these reviews. I noticed that Fusion still holds up incredibly well. It is a stellar example of what can be done in spite of limitations of hardware and screen size, as neither of those things feel like they're at play at all in this case. The game is truly underrated and probably the GBA game I have played the most over the last several years.